Is NFL Divisional Playoff Weekend. Yes, we're going to break these games down today. If you're watching live, I know some people watch recorded. It's Wednesday. We're breaking down the two AFC games. On Thursday, we'll break down the two NFC games. On Saturday, now Instagram won't get the Saturday feed because I work with John Ryan and I can't get the dual setup there. But on RotoWire YouTube, RotoWire Twitter, and Facebook, Saturday, the gambling show, 11:30 a.m. Eastern. Now, I'll go over prop bets here today, but John Ryan, professional gambler, great gambling mind, will give you some trends and great bets. Some DFS I'll go over with you. But again, I'll set you up for DFS here, too. I'm going to kind of go over each player a bit as I break these games down. And definitely will be working through threads on Twitter. If you're not following me at Jim Coventry NFL on Twitter, please do. I will post threads as we get to the week, give you detailed breakdowns to help you with your player props, help you determine who you're betting on, or if you just like the games. Right now, it's not so much about fantasy football unless you're playing DFS. It's more about betting, props, enjoying the games, and just getting that playoff vibe going. All right, let's get rolling here. We are starting out again, two games here, AFC only. We are doing the Jacksonville Jaguars at the Kansas City Chiefs. Now that game, hey, Randy, that game will kick off Saturday at 4:30 Eastern time. The Chiefs are an 8.5-point favorite here. The over and under on this game is 53. The Chiefs' individual team total is 31.5. The Jaguars is all the way down at 21.5. Now, remember, these teams did meet in week 10 of the regular season. In that game, the Chiefs went up 20-0 with less than a minute and a half. And then the Jaguars, after the last touchdown to make it 20-0, they scooted down the field in 30 seconds and they got a touchdown before going into the locker room. So it was an amazing short score. I want to say it was like a 33-yard pass to Marvin Jones that got him kind of bailed out there. But they go into the half 20-7. And then Kansas City, they kind of pile on, another touchdown in the third quarter, 27-10 at the end of 3. Jacksonville gets a late touchdown. Now, Jacksonville had opportunities in that game. I want to say Riley Patterson missed a field goal. They did have opportunities on offense that didn't quite work out. Trevor Lawrence made a couple of bigger mistakes. And as great as Trevor Lawrence is becoming, it really has been a roller coaster season. He had a number of struggles, and then he had a hot streak, and then he went back to the struggle zone. Remember the last 3 games of the regular season, he wasn't hitting the end zone at all. He had nothing going on. So, and it was a tough stretch. I know everyone said the 49ers were in there, the Jets were in there. It was not a good stretch, but he didn't perform very well. And then, of course, we saw last week the 4 touchdowns. We already covered that game, so we're not going to dwell back. But anyway, as we look at this game, I really think that the Chiefs have a number of tactical advantages. They're coming off the bye. The rest is massive. Playing at Arrowhead, big deal. The Jaguars, coming off of such an emotional victory, I think that is a thing. When you come off of a game like that, it's very easy to come out flat. And look, I talk about the war between the ears all the time. Look, my job is to break down football, but ultimately I try to give you the well-rounded approach, the psychological approach, the X's and O's approach, and the numbers approach. Jacksonville is going to struggle to come out on their A game because of that real emotional victory. So now let's go to the Chiefs side of the ball. Now the Jaguars, we talked about this last week. You're typically not running the ball on the Jaguars. This isn't like the Ray Lewis Ravens, but they're a very, very strong run defense. You don't get a sustaining rushing attack against them. But Andy Reid, he doesn't really want to run the ball anyway. And we'll talk about in a minute when we get to the running backs how they actually will run the ball, because they will have some opportunity and success, but we'll get to that. We'll break this down. And then the pass rush for the Jaguars has been outstanding. But what is their weakness? Pass defense. They struggle in the secondary. And the problem is there are a number of weak spots. They have their slot corner play, not great. Their left cornerback play, not great. Strong safety when put into coverage, not great. And so ultimately, the Chiefs have many diverse weapons. And this is just the type of team. Jacksonville can't come in and say, all right, well, if we make a plan for this guy, we stop them. The Chiefs have not operated like that all year. And this type of defense plays into them from a huge advantage standpoint. If that pass rush were to get going, Jerick McKinnon in the screen game, obviously Travis Kelce in the short area. And the Jaguars have been one of the worst teams in the league against tight ends. Now, they do allow the fifth most fantasy points, but we have just seen them get eaten alive. And we talked last week. We like Donald Parham. 2 touchdowns were there, man. 2 touchdowns were there. Great defensive play, broke up one. And Justin Herbert looked the other way on the second one. But Gerald Everett, who had not been doing much, went off. As I said a moment ago, the Jags don't have the personnel to say, all right, we're going to bracket Travis Kelce. They don't have that. And if they do, they can't compromise their defense and all the other receivers. So again, we're getting individual players, but we're kind of talking game planning here. So realistically, what do the Jaguars have to do? They have 2 main options. One is to literally drop 8. And we've seen it work. Different teams run it better. The communication when Cincinnati does that is so much better between the safeties and the corners and even the linebackers just passing players off. That's what makes that kind of work. But dropping 8 and making Mahomes nickel and dime, which he will be able to do, that is one path they can take. The other path is going to be the risky route of, you know what? Let's bring the house more than not. Let's just blitz. And you know how that's going to work out, especially since McKinnon's been a great hot read in the screen game. And again, with the diverse receivers they have, and Kadarius Toney is weaponized to where he could get the ball in the short area and just make a whole lot happen. So I think the blitz approach is unlikely to be used because I think they realize the risk reward ratio is not in the stratosphere. It's going to have to be drop bodies and just hope for the best. Because remember, the Chiefs do have a very good offensive line. They're a top 7 pass blocking line. So they can contend with significant pressure and be fine. But of course, Mahomes breaks contain, and many argue, and I'll be in that camp, that he is often more dangerous when he does break the contain. So again, I think the Jags really have one option here, and they just have to hope fate is on their side. Now, let's go by the individual players because we know that we'll like to bet props. We'll do the prop show Saturday. We know that you'll play DFS. And so, excuse me. All right. I do think this is the game where Mahomes very strong likelihood of doing what he's been doing, getting over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. He has done that in the vast majority of games since really the middle of the season. He has put together a big number of these big games. And again, he has the line, he has a vast array of weapons, and the Jaguars really don't have the defensive firepower to deal with those weapons. So Mahomes should be in great shape here. Now, let's go to the running back room, and we'll start with Jerick McKinnon. Now, in that first game, McKinnon was targeted 8 times. He caught 6 for 56, but he has become a monster down the stretch. He has had 3 huge games in his last time. He scored in 6 straight. And the whole thing is now he is such on the same page with Mahomes. And I mean, we remember how Travis Kelce, and he still is, okay, but we remember how Travis Kelce was great when a play broke down of knowing right where to go. McKinnon has gotten to that level right now, and his explosiveness, even in his post-30 age, is still ridiculous. And when defenses can't focus on him, that is a bit to go. Vorador, glad you're here. All right. So I do think McKinnon – now remember, before I get that, the Jaguars give the 3rd most receptions, which is 6 per game, and the 4th most receiving yards to running backs. Now here's the odd stat. They haven't given up a receiving touchdown to a running back. It's kind of random, but they haven't given up a touchdown to a receiving back. This is where that could go. I do think there's a great chance, and this is really floor-ish. McKinnon should get you at least 45 yards receiving here, and there is upside for a lot more because, again, we talk about the plays breaking down and how Mahomes is able to leverage McKinnon in those situations and the favorable looks. And again, with McKinnon be able to find those spots. So at 45 yards is kind of the floor. I think we could see 75, 80 yards if we get that big play, which is always knocking on the door. He's not going to get much rushing work here. He might get 3 or 4 carries. He's really been seeing 6 or fewer carries in most games. So we're not going to get a lot of rushing production. Now, Isaiah Pacheco, and this is where we got to understand. I mentioned earlier how Jacksonville is excellent against the run. But if their defensive approach, as I see it, you're going to have to significantly drop 8. I just don't think dropping 7 is enough. Well, obviously, if you're putting 3 up and you've got a linebacker back, there is going to be room to run. And the run blocking for the Chiefs is actually better than the pass blocking. And so to get that boost, Pacheco is a perfect style for this type of defensive approach because he's decisive. He immediately hits the hole. He does not waste energy. And if you're dropping 8, that allows him to quickly get to the second level. And, he won't get much after that, especially with the dropping of defenders that I expect. But he had 16 carries for 82 yards in that first matchup. And he's had between 58 and $107 in his 6 of his last 7 games. So he's been a very consistent floor producer, high floor, right? And Jacksonville's given up at least 52 rushing yards to both Zeke Elliott and Tony Pollard in the same game. Obviously, Derrick Henry, DeAndre Swift, Gus Edwards, and Pacheco himself. So this plays right into that. So yes, Pacheco should get you at least 60 yards in this game. So we'll be looking out on the props for those. I actually have to dig into the prop numbers. I was planning on doing that tomorrow, but I will do threads on the props at Jim Coventry NFL, and I will, get these final numbers and roll with those. The only concern for Pacheco having a bigger game is I don't think he'll play. I don't think Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to play much, but if the Chiefs somehow get a big lead, I could see them getting him reps. I still think Pacheco sails over 60 yards. I don't know that he hits 100. I really think it's like that 60 to 85 game based on his usage, his situation, and the fact that McKinnon's going to be heavily involved. He'll play Pacheco less than half the snaps. Now, the receivers, these are really hard to handicap because ultimately it's going to be what the defense approach gives to the Chiefs on given plays. I think they're going to limit explosives here. They got beat up in that first game. Obviously, who gets beat up is the Chiefs, right? And then MVS hit them for a touchdown as well. I think they're going to limit explosives, and so there's going to be receptions, yardage will get there, but I just don't know. It's hard to say which player is going to come out. Now, if you do like a dart here, Kadarius Toney's worth looking at. In that first match, it was actually his best game of the season. He went through that game, 5 targets, caught 4 for 57 and a touchdown. He ran twice for 33 yards, so he posted 90 yards in that game. But again, if Jacksonville's going to drop players or if and when they choose to blitz, we're already seeing that Mahomes will use Toney as that hot read and his quick area explosiveness. That is going to be paramount as far as the Chiefs go in the playoffs. And Andy Reid has been scheming up plays for him. They won't use them all in one game, but Andy Reid's been scheming stuff. He understands the type of explosiveness that Toney brings. And this is the time of year that we're going to see that. Now, Juju Smith-Schuster, it's been a weird season. He had a really strong hot streak where he was rolling a bit, but he's been held to 35 or fewer yards in 4 of his last 6. Now, he did have that 74 and a touchdown and 88 yards in week 14 and 15. So he had a recent little stretch where he was going. And in that middle part of the season, when he only had the 2 for 33 against the Jaguars in week 10, he was at that time where he's coming back from the concussion. Snaps were limited. So that game wasn't really a litmus test for what he is here. But his role has seemed to diminish from earlier in the season when he was seeing 7-8 targets a game. That's dropped quite a bit. And so his role is uncertain. And then Valdez-Scantling has 3 or fewer catches in 11 of 12 games. And he's only has 2 touchdowns all year. He was 3 for 60 and a score on 4 targets in that week 10 meeting, but it's very hard to go and say Valdez-Scantling's going to have a big game. He's not the same guy he was in Green Bay. He's not used the same way. And like I said, I'm going to keep going back to the defensive approach that I'm anticipating. The Jaguars are going to have to drop bodies. Well, that's going to limit explosives. So I think Valdes-Scantling is probably looking at 30 yards here in this game, and it could be a 0 game for him because the way they set up this defense, I don't know that his route tree is going to mesh well with that. So I'm not particularly looking for much uses from Valdes-Scantling. And we could see rotation where he gets a less favorable than usual snap count, although that one, not certain. But again, they could bump Tony's usage up. They could do that. They could bump Sky Moore, who's coming back from the hand laceration. They could bump his usage up because if they're dropping 8, really those are the guys that you want on the field to eat into that. And Andy Reid, again, he hasn't used Sky Moore much, but there was that 2-week stretch earlier in the year where he had 6 targets in 2 straight games. Now, Travis Kelce, matchup doesn't get better here. Like I said earlier, Jags up the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends. They get gashed by the tight ends. And this is clearly a great matchup. Now, in week 10, Kelce caught 6 passes for 81 and a touchdown on 7 targets. Now, the second half was not kind to Travis Kelce. It could just be happenstance. It's a long season, variance. That's all there. He's an aging player. And, coming into this year, I had to look back last year. He had 5 games with low yardage for him. And so to me, that was a sign that maybe things were slowing down. And then he came and tore the roof off this year. So in the first half of the season, I just want to point this out, before we get into Travis Kelce a little bit more. But in the first 10 games, he was averaging 7 catches, 85 yards, and over a touchdown, 1.1 touchdowns. He was averaging 22 PPR points a game. In the last 7 games, averaging 5.5 catches, 69 yards. He scored once. He's averaging 13.3 fantasy points. Now, you could say the difference is the touchdowns. Because obviously 6 points a touchdown, and you scored 11 touchdowns in 10 games and 1 in 7. So that bridges a lot of that difference here. But we're looking at 16 fewer yards per game. We're looking at a catch and a half fewer per game. It could just be variance. I do expect that Kelce will be heavily involved when the game planning is done, as obviously Andy Reid realizes the weakness of the defense here. He should easily go over 75 yards here. Now we'll see where his prop is. The prop may come in somewhere right around there, but 75 yards should be a fairly safe number for him. I do think at home, playoff experience, tactical advantage with their receivers. I do think they're in well positioned to go over that team total of 31.5 that Vegas is projecting. Now let's look at the Jaguars offense here. So now back in week 10, the Chiefs will have the luxury to make adjustments based on that game. Now you may say, well, of course the Jaguars can. Again, we talk about the Jaguars' weaknesses going right to the Kansas City strength. So my adjustment for them was to drop 8, but it's not going to solve the problem. They just lack the defensive personnel to do what they need to do to slow this offense down. That's where the problem comes in. On the other hand, we saw Trevor Lawrence have success with Zay Jones, Christian Kirk, really those two. They had success in that first meeting. Now, the Chiefs can make adjustments here. Here's what I expect them to do defensively. Now, Trent McDuffie had been not healthy all year. He's coming in fully healthy. He and L'Jarius Sneed grade out as very strong coverage corners. Marvin Jones is not a receiver to worry about at this stage of his career. Zay Jones has been played well, performed well, been very opportunistic, but ultimately a good corner should be able to limit him. I expect L'Jarius Sneed and Trent McDuffie to basically man up those 2 receivers. That's what I expect. And then I expect with the zone part, I expect the flooding of the middle of the field. I think they want to flood the middle of the field to limit Evan Ingram and to certainly limit Christian Kirk. I think that's the way they want to come in here. Now, the Jaguars have been very good in pass protection, top 8 in pass protection. And the Chiefs have had a very good pressure rate, seventh pressure rate. And so they're a team that can get heat. And left tackle Cam Robinson was injured his knee a few weeks back, and he's out for the season. That's a big deal. The Cam Robinson injury is big because this is the first game where it might show up as a problem. But I don't think the Chiefs are necessarily they'll blitz selectively. They'll get Willie Gay coming on the blitz selectively. When they get that 3rd and long, even 2nd and long, they're going to want to leverage the blitzes when they think they can and potentially even jump routes. They will have learned some things from Brandon Staley's first half game plan last week, but Steve Spagnuolo will have some wrinkles to that. So I do think the talent advantage at corner versus outside receiver is squarely in the favor of the Chiefs here. Now, let's go position by position. So Trevor Lawrence, I think his best opportunity for props and fantasy will be potential for garbage time. That's where I see that factoring in. As I said, I think that's a selective blitz. Now, I assume Brandon Sheriff, the guard, is going to be healthy. The center is a liability in pass protection, but the guards are okay. So I think they can deal to a degree with Chris Jones. I think they can deal to a degree because you remember he's an interior primary. They've moved to the outside on occasion, but he's the interior pressure. So when they bring Willie Gay on the outside, preferably on the Cam Robinson vacated side where the injured tackle is out, I think that's where they're going to make some hay. But I don't think overall the base pass rush is going to overwhelm Trevor Lawrence here. He would strongly benefit by throwing to his running backs because this Kansas City team is one that gives up a lot of production to running backs. They give the most receptions in the league to running backs. And so now the yardage isn't extreme, but the receptions are there. And I do think that they're going to want to try to get Travis Etienne the ball. We'll talk about him in a minute. Ultimately, I still think Christian Kirk gets a little bit done. We'll talk about him as well. I think Trevor Lawrence is not looking at a high yardage game here. I really do think the Chiefs are going to have answers for them, the adjustments from week 10. I think Trevor Lawrence throws for 245 and 2 touchdowns here. Now, Trevor Lawrence has not had all big games. Remember, it's when you go back over Stanley, he's had plenty of low volume games, especially down the stretch. He had them. So remember, what we've seen recently last week isn't necessarily the version we're getting here. I think this is a big stage, and I think the matchup, Steve Spagnuolo is going to have a really good clue here. Now, Travis Etienne. People will think back, they'll think, wait, Kansas City, they can't stop the run. They've been decent. They've been decent all year, and they've gotten better. Down the stretch, so like the first half of the season, they were like very, very middling. They've gotten a little better than middling against the run. Now, is that because they're leading games and teams don't run as much? Maybe some of it. But overall, they've gotten better functionality in their run defense. So they are better than they were. So they definitely can hold up a bit there. So now ETN has done extremely well, especially against favorable opponents. And this is a middling matchup. This is a middling matchup. I have no issue with the matchup for him. If they fall behind, he could get games scripted out of the running part of the game. And we've seen them go to JaMycal Hasty when they've trailed, and not every game, but we've seen him snap share go up in games they have to throw to the running backs. Now, I assume they believe the pass protection from Hasty is a tick better than it is with ETN, which that would be an issue. Because if they had to become one-dimensional, the Chiefs would rethink their pressuring of the quarterback strategies. All right, so ETN, though, has at least 83 rushing yards in 4 of his last 5 games, and they have seen that uptick in receptions, and that's been beneficial. So I do project him. I project him on the ground and not have a big game here. I think he gets you about 45 to 55 yards around because his carries are going to be limited. That's why. It's not because he's going to run poorly. It's because they're going to fall behind him most likely. I do think he catches 4 catches. I'm going to put him about 27 yards in this one. So I do think his catch prop may be very useful because he will be needed. They will want him on the field for potential explosives in that capacity. Now, the receivers, I mentioned earlier, I do expect L'Jarius Sneed, and I expect Trent McDuffie to man up the outside receivers. That's what I'm fully expecting here. Now, Zay Jones, he went 8 for 68 on 10 targets in the first matchup. They were chasing, and that happens. You pile up these numbers. So he was able to do that very well. But again, they saw him in that game. Zay Jones had 13 targets in a wild card game, caught 8 for 74 and a touchdown. Going into the postseason, he had 24 or fewer yards in his last 3 games. Now, on conversely, when you put the sample size out to 8 games, he was 68 or more in 4 of those games. So he's been pretty boom or bust. He'll often get you 4 to 8 targets. Now, he's only scored in 2 of his last 13 games. That's been a total of 4 touchdowns. He had the 3-touchdown game. I think because they're going to trail and they'll have to throw, I do think he gets 6 catches. I think his yardage is very suppressed here. I have him down at 48 yards because I do think the cornerback will outclass him. Either one. Either Snead or McDuffie. I do believe either one will not have an issue with Zay Jones, again, because they saw him. Marvin Jones, well, we know this. He did get the touchdown last week, 3 for 29. His only 2 games over 50 yards this season were against Houston and Houston. I think there's a third game in there, but his 2 of his games over 50 yards were against Houston. He struggled everywhere else. Great player in his prime. He's not there anymore. He's going 3 catches for 25 yards here. He's not getting over the top anymore. He's overmatched here. 3 for 25 is all I'm going for. So he'll be, depending what his number is, to watch it, he could be an under prop on the yardage. We'll see what it is. I may set it right around 30, so be careful. It might be really close. We don't like to make them too close. Now, Christian Kirk. So in terms of slot receivers, Jerry Jeudy, who has been playing a lot in the slot for Denver, he had that 8 for 73 and 3 touchdowns, and then he came back with a 7 for 38. So it was like, okay, adjustments were made, right? So that was important to understand. Tyler Boyd hit them up 4 for 60. Those are notable slot receivers against them. And I got a sneeze coming on. Isn't that just lovely? We'll see if I have to sneeze. I'll put my arm up if I have to do that, which might be coming quickly here. All right. In the wildcard game, Christian Kirk had 14 targets, catching 8 for 78 in a score. In that Week 10 matchup against the Chiefs, he went off 9 for $105 and 2 touchdowns on 12 targets. They will pay definite attention to Christian Kirk here. Now, he has had 6 or fewer receptions in his previous 7 games before the playoffs. So that's important to know. He was held to 46 or fewer yards in 4 of those last 7 games. Again, this is regular season we're looking at here. Although when you take the other games in there, in 4 of his last 8, he's over 92. So he has that range where he's like 90 or more or 46 or less. So we definitely have seen that kind of range where it's more of a boom bust type guy. He's only scored in 1 of his last 7 games before last week's playoff game. I do think he gets in the end zone here. I think by default, even though they're going to flood the middle of the field, I think that Trevor Lawrence is going to have to go to him, and I think he gets 8 for 75, and I do think he gets a touchdown. The routes they chose to use him both in the red zone and sometimes even when they're outside the red zone, they can run some really complicated routes that really get him from the slot, those free releases. I do think it can happen for him, so I like him. Now, Evan Ingram, 7 for 93 and a touchdown last week. When he played the Chiefs in Week 10, 3 for 14 on 4 targets. Rough game. Now, Evan Ingram going into the playoffs was 30 or fewer yards in 6 of his last 9. And he had that great week, the 14 stretch where he went off, but then he quieted down. I mean, he's been very, very boom bust. Now, the Chiefs have been fairly good against tight ends. I mean, George Kittle lit him up for 98 and a touchdown. Dawson Knox, 37 yards. He did score. Darren Waller, 2 for 35. Dulcich, 3 for 42. Hayden Hurst, 2 for 14. They allow the 14th most points to tight ends, but they've done a fairly solid job. I think Ingram goes 3 for 37 here. That's about where I have him. So closing this game out, Jacksonville, as I said earlier, they're just weak in the wrong areas on defense. They are coming off a big emotional win, and now they're headed into a hostile road environment. Now, in terms of the point spread, I always worry with the Chiefs. The Chiefs are the team that takes their foot off the gas when they have a game in hand. Happens very, very frequently. Good teams can make those comebacks. So I think the final score will not indicate the competitiveness of the game. I think the Jaguars score some late points and they get a backdoor cover and an over on this game. I have a Chiefs 33, Jaguars 27. Again, not that close, but late points. Jaguars are getting 8.5. I think it's a backdoor cover. The over and under on this game at 53. I do think this game says over because of that potential garbage time. All right, let's go to our last AFC game. Remember, Thursday's NFC. If you like the content here, and you love RotoWire, go to rotowire.com/try. No credit card need to get you 2 free days behind the paywall. Check out what we're all about. We'd love to have you as part of the team. Said earlier, if you're on YouTube, please smash the like and subscribe button. Would appreciate that greatly. And again, whatever platform you're on, I'm glad you're hanging with me. All right, Bengals and Bills. Damar Hamlin, he's moving better. I'm so happy for him. So happy for Damar Hamlin. And I'm sure he'll be excited to be watching the game in whatever capacity he can. So I'm very excited for him. But this is the matchup they had where he had the unfortunate injury that he's now recovering well from. This game is Sunday at 3 Eastern. The Bills are -5 in this one. Over and under is 49. Bills team totals 26.5. The Bengals are at 21.5. Now, very important. So we've been talking for weeks. Right tackle Lyle Collins, we know he had the season-ending injury. He's out. And then a couple of weeks ago, they lose their right guard, Alex Cappa, to an ankle injury. He's not practiced as of Wednesday. He's not expected to play. And then finally, we have Jonah Williams, who dislocated his kneecap in the wild card game. It seems very unlikely he'll play. So now they're down 3 of their better linemen. Now, some of you will say, oh, wait a minute. Burrow did fine for the most part with really no offensive line last year. But here's what I want you to understand. So it was a bad line last year, but it was cohesive. And sometimes, yes, he was getting sacked. Burrow was getting sacked 9 times, I think, in that Tennessee game, if I remember correctly. But the cohesiveness at times could help. This problem is we may have a worse level of talent on this year's line, and players are being dumped in and they haven't worked together. Therefore, the communication won't be there. The talent's not there. And the Bengals, now I know they lost Von Miller months ago, but this team can pressure heavily without blitzing. And against this line and not having to sacrifice pass defenders, that's problematic for the Bengals. So they are going to have their work cut out here for them here. Now, conversely, Buffalo's secondary is not nearly as lethal as it was last year. Tre'Davious White coming back from the knee injury, he does not quite look to be the player that we had seen in the past. They're down to their 3rd string free safety, and other players in that secondary have been nicked up. We are not seeing the high level of performance that we saw last year. So the secondary, again, not shut down as they had been in the past. In terms of attacking them, they clearly are going to do what most AFC teams that know the Bengals have done. They're going to put a roof over Jamar Chase. They don't want to get beat by the big play. Can Jamar Chase make a big play? Of course he can. He's Jamar Chase. But if you look over the season, he hasn't busted, I think, 133 yards in a game. And his 230-yard games, both against NFC South teams. I talked about this earlier in the year. It's the teams that don't know Chase, and they see him for that first time. The tape does not portray the real speed that he has. When teams have seen him and they're used to it, they can prepare for that. So Chase will be fine, but again, it's more likely than not he doesn't go off, and the Bills are going to put cloud coverage for him especially because he's the one that they're worried about. You can't let him break the game open or get hot. But I do think ultimately their plan is to really focus on those outside receivers, to focus on Chase, to focus a little less but significantly on Higgins. It's going to leave the middle of the field. Again, we got 3rd string free safety. Going to help. Their slot coverage has not been elite. So I do think there's areas in the middle of the field. But I think that Zach Taylor, this is what I call that T. Higgins game. You see a lot of zone. T. Higgins with the big body is going to get into the middle of the field. They're going to run him on crossers more. I think they're not going to be running him. They'll often run him on those downfield straight routes, 9 routes. I don't think they're going to do a lot of that here. I think it's going to be a lot of getting him the ball quickly, getting the ball in hitches, and then getting him to run through the defense and use his physicality. So I do think even though the defensive game plan is going to be to lean against him, secondary to Chase, I think that he does have a very good game here. We'll talk about him in a minute. And I do think the opportunities for Hayden Hurst and Tyler Boyd are going to be somewhat significant. Now, all right, so let's break it down position by position here. So Joe Burrow, man, the Ravens certainly did well against him this year. Fewer than 220 yards in all 3 games. Burrow got the win. That's all that matters, right? Now, at the end of the regular season, Burrow had fewer than 240 yards in 3 of his last 4 games, and he had fewer than 240 in 7 different games. So it wasn't like he was big yardage all year. It definitely wasn't the case, right? And so anyway, when we go into this game, this Cincinnati offensive line was already the 3rd worst pass blocking unit. And again, Jonah Williams not expected to play in another game without Alex Kapp. I mentioned this already. And obviously we know Lyle Collins is there. And that's very problematic, I said, is against a Bills team that can pressure without the blitz. And the pass defense for the Bills has been rated number 11. I think that's over the course of the season. It's per Pro Football Focus. But overall, again, this not quite elite, okay? Now, they give the 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. I do think that the pressure is going to be a real problem. But I do think Zach Taylor is going to have a game plan to get the ball out quickly and utilize Higgins, crossers, short, Boyd, Hurst. I think they're going to get it out quickly. I think they're going to make it a priority. I don't know how much they're going to try to work with the run game. The run game hasn't been doing well. Again, the offensive line leans into that as well. There might be a couple more screens than usual here. So I do think that Mixon is in a situation where I think he's going to get you a fair amount of passing yardage. I think he's going to nickel and dime his way, and he's going to carve out this path to 305 yards. I think he's just going to barely scrape it, but it's going to be on the volume of maybe 50-ish pass attempts. I think that's what's going to get him there. And I think he throws for a couple touchdowns here. Now, Mixon, 11 for 39 carries against the Ravens. That's no surprise. Ravens have been great against the run. Now, Mixon had, going into the playoffs, 11 to 16 carries in his last 4 games. His rushing yardage was 27, 65, 21, and 96, all over the board. And going into last week's play, and I was so upset with the prop, by the way. I had bet the prop if he had to have over 3.5 receptions. He had 3. Man, Burrow threw a little check down him right here, flat dropped it. Easy cover on the prop. Thank you, Joe Mixon. Appreciate you. Anyway, all right, enough of the sour grapes. But he had 5 to 7 receptions in those last 3 regular season games. So he was really getting work in the receiving game. So that was pretty big. And he had on the season at least 3 receptions in every game but week 14. So really, Joe Mixon has been, a solid floor reception guy. Now, he only scored once in his last 4 games. Now, the run blocking on the season was good for the Bengals, but again, we can't look at it that way. We have to realize the current injury states and realize this is probably not going to be a good run blocking line here. Now, in terms of receiving production, the Bills are pretty middle of the road in what they allow. 13th most receptions, 12, fewest fantasy points to running backs. So you're not going to get great production through the air. I think ultimately Mixon gets enough carries to get him the 45 yards, and I think he gets a couple catches for 14 yards, and only a couple catches. Here's why. The pass protection is going to be an issue. I think they're going to have to strongly consider Samaje Perine's pass protection, and I think that might be a path to them in this game to keep Burrow upright. They need, because Joe Mixon is not a good pass protector. Samaje Perine is. I think they know, obviously, Mixon's overall a better runner, but I think that's not what's important here. It's going to be getting Burrow that extra fraction of time. Now, Perine was hardly used in the wildcard games. 2 carries for 3 yards. He had a target, didn't catch it. The Ravens are not a team you fear from the pressure angle. They're not the nasty Ravens passers of years past. So I think they were okay with it, and they won. And so I think in this game, they've got to use him a little bit more. So I actually have Perine getting 4 catches for 23 yards because they're going to have to get that pass pro going. 11 rush yards gotten for. Now, Jamar Chase, we talked before. There will be cloud coverage over him. We've seen AFC teams that have seen him perform well. He gets it done. I mean, I have him for 7 catches and 83 yards here. It's a pretty typical game for him. Going into the playoffs, and even with the wild card game, 5 of his last 6 games, he's been between 79 and 119 yards. He's been right in that smashed up range, and that's what he's getting. And there's nothing wrong with that. Those are good performances, but it's just not getting the little lifting games we saw last year. So I have him with 7 catches for 83, like I said. I told you earlier, the 2 big games he had were against NFC South teams. Those were the 2 big games he had. He hadn't had more than 132 yards in a game all year, and those two big games. NFC South. So now T. Higgins, I said earlier, I do think they're going to get him the ball on a lot of slants. They're going to work him in the middle of the field, a chain mover. He also has the ability to run after the catch. So I do think he's a big focal point of the passing game. I do think this is a T. Higgins game. I think I have him for 8 catches, 115 yards and a touchdown. I think he's a good DFS play. I think betting him on the prop is a very good play. I think this is a game where he is going to be a big part of the game plan. And now Tyler Boyd, wild card game, 3 catches for 26 yards. He caught all of his targets. Now, he only has 2 games over 66 yards this year. One was against Atlanta. That was a nice, easy one. But he did do it against the Jets, and the Jets, 2 great outside corners. It was a game, 4 catches, 105 yards, middle of the field. Smart to attack that. He's been over 40 yards in 4 of his last 8. And actually, he's only been held to 33 yards or less 3 times all year, so he has a good floor about him each week. And I think this is a game where he gets some targets. I am for 4 for 42. There's going to be somebody who gets a second touchdown. It's going to be the middle of the field. It's going to be Boyd or it's going to be Hurst. I'm going to put it on Boyd right here, but it just could easily be Hurst. And then, like I said, with Hurst, same thing, middle of the field. Now, overall, Kelsey lit him up, the Bengals, for 8 for $1.08. But TJ Hockenson, 7 catches, 45 yards, not a lot there. Pat Fryermuth, 2 for 12. Mark Andrews, although Mark Andrews had a lot of down games, to 2 for 15 in there. And then we saw him in the playoffs do well. I'm sorry, back off of that one. Forget it. 2 for 15. That's what we had. Scratch it. Done. I have Hurst with 3 catches for 27 yards. I just think he'll get, help move the chains a couple times, but I think that ultimately he's not going to be a big part of this game. All right, let's move to the Buffalo side of the ball. So Cincinnati, Lou Anarumo, defensive coordinator. So he has seen teams put cloud coverage and even bracketing on Stephon Diggs. They've had varying levels of success. Diggs hasn't had a lot of signature games this year. All right. So I do think they're going to come in. He'll be the focal point. And I think they'll go with the game plan saying, all right, we're going to see if the other receivers beat us. Gabe Davis is really week to week. Cole Beasley looks good working his way back. Certainly he's a factor here, but I think they're willing, Dawson Knox, tight end, I think they're willing to take their chances and let the other guys beat them and make Josh Allen nickel and dime him a little bit. I think Anarumo goes to what he's done with the Chiefs. I think he drops 8 and puts a spy on Allen for running the ball. And they've been very good against quarterbacks running. They've really held rushing quarterbacks for the most part down and suppressed their production. So that's worked there as well. I think they're willing and they want to dare Buffalo to run the ball. They want them to run the ball. If they give up yards in the run game, they're fine with that. They don't want to get beat by Josh Allen. I think they're willing to do that. I think they're also going to use a lot of post-snap disguise to try to confuse Josh Allen. Josh Allen's been very careless with the ball this year. He now has 16 interceptions, including the playoffs. There were 13 fumbles going in last week. Last week, he fumbled 3 times. He only lost 1 of them. But he has been very careless with the football. He's been a very boomer bust player. And the Bengals defense has to lean into that. They have to try to put him with that disguised coverages to get him to make those mistakes and see if they could capitalize on those. Now, Josh Allen, understand this, going into the playoffs, and he had 350 last week, all right? But it was a lot of the Dolphins did what they had to do, brought the house a lot. So they backed off later in the game, a lot of zero coverage, so no safety help, and he got the 352 because he took what was there, and it worked. But going into the playoffs, Allen was 254 or fewer yards in 6 of his last 7 games. Now, early in the season, he was doing great, 297 more in 5 of his first 6, but ultimately – he hasn't been the same level of the yardage passer down the stretch, okay? And his rushing, he only had 20 yards last week. So going into the playoffs, he had at least 41 yards in 3 of his last 4, but 11 times all year. But he hasn't had a lot of those ceiling rushing games. And last week at only 20, with all that blitzing, that surprised me. I thought he would take off more. I said Cincinnati is better in suppressing running back runs. I do think they're going to have a spy. I think they're going to limit him. I have him with 35 rush yards in this, so we'll see where the prop falls for that. I do have him with 285 passing yards. I don't think he goes over 3. I think he gets enough done. I don't think it's a nuclear game for him, and I do think he throws a pair of touchdown tosses. Now, the running game, mentioned earlier, I think that, we got DJ Reader in the middle with BJ Hill, nice tackle duo, but they're not going to do anything behind him behind those two to try to stop the run. They're going to dare them to run. So I think Devin Singletary gets about 12 carries. He's pretty normal. He's 14 or fewer carries in his last 6 games going into the playoffs. And last week he only had 10 carries. So I think it's similar to last week. I think 12 for 46. He'll get some yardage because the defense is not going to sell out for that. And I think James Cook sees a similar workload, but a few more yards. I think he goes 11 for 51. And I think he gets a couple catches for 21 yards. So James Cook might be a slightly better play. One of them could find the end zone. That would ultimately make the difference. So again, both have some production. I don't think either goes off. I don't think the Bills will commit to it. They'll split the work up as they've been. Singletary is seeing more snaps, but Cook is seeing a higher percentage of usage on his snaps. Now, in the passing game, I mentioned earlier, I'm expecting cloud coverage or bracketing or both on Stephon Diggs. He did go 7 for $114 in the wildcard game. He has 2 straight 100-yard games, but did you know those 2 games were the first time he had 100 yards since week 10? So he had been getting those. He's putting up good floor yardage, right? But he hasn't been putting up those big signature games. And last week he had like 94 yards at the half, and he ended up at 114. And so I do think it's that game, 8 for 90. That's about what we're seeing. He's going to get targets, so he's going to get production. But I think that the Bengals are going to keep him from having that elite game. I think he's the guy that gets in the end zone. I think he does get in the end zone in a big game here. I think that. Now, Gabe Davis. So ultimately, outside. So here are some outside receivers that are bigger type receivers. They play bigger. Well, Mike Evans is a big receiver. He went 5 for 83. Amari Cooper this year on the outside, he played bigger than he was, I thought. And he went 2 for 42. Donovan Peoples-Jones, 8 for $114. Treylon Burks, 4 for 70. George Pickens, 4 for 83. So I think bigger receiver do well against this defense. And I do think Gabe Davis is getting targets. I mean, he has 6 to 10 targets, 10 times in 15 games. I think he's a solid 5 for 64 here. That's what I have him for. I do think it's a solid game. I think he is not one of those down games where he has 25, 28 yards. I think he's enough targets. The defense is not going to make him the focal point, and they're going to drop coverage, but he'll be able to get his catches. And then Isaiah McKenzie is back practicing. I was surprised. He injured his hamstring last week, was ruled out, and he's back practicing. So that's a good sign for him. But he has really not been a factor down the stretch. He had 25 or fewer yards in his last 5 games. So he has not been a big factor here. And he's only over 25 yards 3 times since week 12. So he has not been a big factor in the offense. I have him for 3 catches for 21 yards. And Khalil Shakir, who I like a lot, I think with McKenzie back, that kind of puts him ticketed back to the bench. Cole Beasley, though, is going to cut into McKenzie snaps. He's going to play on high leverage downs. There could be times if they have to put a 4th receiver on the field. They don't like to do it. They used to do that. They do a lot more heavy personnel and throw out a heavy right now, which has been nice for them. But that connection's back. So I do think Beasley goes, I have him 4 for 39 and a touchdown. I think his ability to get open in the end zone and the red zone, I think that's going to be very paramount here against the zone that Cincinnati plays. And then Dawson Knox. So this defense will be favorable to tight ends. Now, Knox has at least 38 yards in 3 of his last 4 regular season games. He was 3 for 20 and a touchdown last week. He did have a catch that was pinned and they got overruled. But he could have been in the 30-ish range there. But I do think he continues to see targets here. And so I do think Dawson Knox him out this one for 4 for 46. We've seen this defense give up 59 yards to David Njoku, 56 to Kelsey, which is obvious. Kelsey's great. 79 to Pat Freiermuth, 41 to Juwan Johnson, 89 to Mark Andrews. So they do give up yardage here. And I think Dawson Knox, we never could predict his targets, which is really the problem. All right, so how do I break this fun down all together before we get out of here? So we all want the shootout, right? I think we're going to get some scoring. I don't think we get a crazy shootout, but I think we get scoring here. Good enough. Cincinnati offensive line injuries, they're a real factor. Again, I mentioned earlier, the cohesion, right? Josh Allen's been careless with the ball, so we've got that. I do lean the home team here. I think that being the home team in this game is significant, but it's a 5-point spread. And I think Joe Burrow is able to cover that one. I have this game going Bills 26-23. So I'm taking the points. And I have it scoring 49 and the over and under is 48.5. That's too close for me to say I'm taking that because it's just a little too – if I have it within a half a point, that's a layoff there. That's a layoff. If I'm going to lean one way or the other, if I'm that close and I have it the over, I would do that, but I'm probably not. Right now, I'm not looking to bet that one. All right, that's the AFC preview. Again, please give me a follow at Jim Coventry NFL on Twitter. I'll be putting threads out, prop bet threads, game breakdown threads, things that can help you be successful this weekend. RotoWire.com/try, 2 free days behind a paywall, no credit card. Give that a shout. All right, everybody, have a great day, and we will talk soon.